Deep beneath the surface of the Coral Sea lies a massive steel tomb that was once the pride of the United States Navy. The darkness here is absolute, and the pressure is crushing. But the silence is the most terrifying aspect of all. This is the final resting place of the United States ship Lexington, which was affectionately known as Lady Lex by the thousands of sailors who served aboard her decks, while the ocean floor is littered with the wreckage of war. There is something uniquely unsettling about this specific carrier. It is not just a collection of rusted metal and decaying aircraft, but a repository of souls who were lost in a violent storm of fire and water. The spirits of the sunken aircraft carrier are said to remain trapped in the cold depths, forever replaying their final chaotic moments. To understand the ghosts that haunt these waters, one must look back to the early days of 1942, when the world was engulfed in the flames of the Second World War. The United States ship Lexington was a colossus of the seas and a floating city that carried the hopes and fears of nearly 3,000 men. She was an early conversion from a battle cruiser hull, which gave her a distinctive silhouette and a massive smokestack that the crew loved. However, beneath the camaraderie and the daily routine of flight operations, there was a palpable tension that hung in the air like heavy fog. Every sailor knew that they were sailing toward a confrontation that could end their lives in an instant. The ship felt alive to them, breathing with the hum of engines and whispering warnings of the doom that awaited them on the horizon. The morning of May 8th, 1942, dawned with a deceptive calm over the South Pacific Ocean. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the waters were relatively smooth, masking the violence that was about to erupt. On the flight deck, pilots prepared their machines for war, while the mechanics and support crews moved with frantic precision. Down below in the cavernous hangars and the sweltering engineering spaces, the men braced themselves for impact. Reports had come in that the Imperial Japanese Navy was closing in, and the Battle of the Coral Sea was reaching its climax. There was a collective holding of breath as the klaxons began to wail, signaling that the enemy aircraft had been spotted. The fear was electric, and it coursed through the steel veins of the ship, infecting every man on board. The attack began not with a whimper, but with the screaming roar of dive bombers plummeting from the clouds like angry raptors. Explosions rocked the ocean's surface, sending geysers of water high into the air. As the United States ship Lexington began her desperate dance to evade destruction, Captain Frederick Sherman stood on the bridge, maneuvering the massive vessel with a calm demeanor that belied the chaos unfolding around him. But the enemy was relentless, and the sky darkened with the smoke of anti-aircraft fire. The first torpedo struck the port side with a sickening thud that vibrated through the entire hull. It was a hammer blow that buckled steel plates and sent shockwaves through the bodies of the men stationed in the lower decks. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into a terrifying darkness filled with the screams of the wounded. Water rushed into the breached compartments with the force of a freight train, sweeping away equipment and men alike. The damage control teams scrambled to contain the flooding, shoring up bulkheads and fighting to keep the ship on an even keel. For a moment, it seemed as though the Lady Lex might survive the onslaught. The engineers worked miracles in the sweltering heat of the boiler rooms, keeping the pressure up so the ship could maintain speed. But the Japanese aviators were not finished, and a second torpedo slammed into the carrier, compounding the devastation. The internal injuries to the ship were severe, and unbeknownst to the crew, a deadly enemy was beginning to spread through the ventilation systems. Aviation fuel lines had ruptured, leaking volatile vapors that turned the ship into a ticking time bomb. The horror truly began hours after the initial attack, when the battle seemed to be over. A spark from a generator ignited the accumulated gasoline fumes deep within the bowels of the ship. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, ripping through the heavy steel doors and scorching everything in its path. Men who had survived the torpedo hits were instantly incinerated by the blast wave that tore through the corridors. The fire spread with a demonic intelligence, feeding on the fuel and the paint and the very air the sailors needed to breathe. Above decks, the flight crews watched in horror as smoke began to pour from the edges of the elevator pits. The beast was dying from the inside out, and the realization of their predicament began to sink in with a cold and heavy dread. Inside the burning carrier, the conditions were nothing short of hellish. The heat was so intense that the paint on the bulkheads blistered and peeled away like dead skin. Sailors trapped in the lower levels found their escape routes blocked by walls of fire and twisted metal. They pounded on the sealed hatches, screaming for salvation that would never come. Their voices joined the cacophony of groaning steel and roaring flames, creating a symphony of suffering that would echo in the minds of the survivors for the rest of their lives. It is said that in those final desperate moments, some men saw apparitions of their loved ones standing amidst the smoke, beckoning them toward a peace that could only be found in death. On the flight deck, the situation was becoming increasingly dire as the fires raged out of control. The forward elevator was blown upward by a massive internal detonation, signaling that the magazines were beginning to cook off. Admiral Aubrey Fitch looked out over the devastating scene and gave the order that no commander ever wants to give. It was time to abandon ship. The order was passed down the line from man to man, and a strange, orderly procession began. There was no panic or rioting, only a grim acceptance of their fate. Men lined up their shoes on the deck in neat rows before sliding down ropes into the oil-slicked water below. Even in the face of total destruction, The discipline of the United States Navy held firm. Captain Sherman waited until the very end, ensuring that every living soul who could be saved had left the vessel. He walked the length of the flight deck, one last time, inspecting the carnage and bidding a silent farewell to his ship. The fires were now consuming the entire superstructure, casting a blood-red glow against the darkening sky. The heat was unbearable, yet Sherman remained cool and collected a solitary figure standing against the inferno. He finally slid down a line into the water, leaving the Lady Lex to face her final moments alone. But as the survivors paddled away in their rafts and life jackets, many of them looked back and swore they saw figures still moving on the burning decks, shadows that refused to leave their posts. The water was warm, but it offered no safety from the horrors of the day. Thousands of men floated in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, watching their home burn. The oil that coated the surface made it difficult to breathe and burned their eyes. Then came the sharks, attracted by the blood and the commotion. The predators began to circle the drifting groups of sailors. The screams of men being pulled under added a fresh layer of terror to the ordeal. Survivors clung to each other, kicking and splashing in a desperate attempt to drive the beasts away. It was a primal struggle for survival, played out in the shadow of the dying aircraft carrier. The fear of what lurked beneath the waves was just as potent as the fear of the fire above. As twilight approached, the United States ship Lexington was a towering pyre that could be seen for miles. The explosions continued to rack her frame, sending debris flying into the sky like meteors. Finally, the destroyer United States ship Phelps was ordered to scuttle the carrier to prevent her from falling into enemy hands or drifting as a derelict hazard. Torpedoes were fired into the burning hull, delivering the coup de grace. The great ship groaned one last time, a sound that many described as a human wail of agony. She rolled to her port side and began to slide beneath the waves. As the bow pointed toward the sky, the survivors witnessed a sight that defied explanation. There were reports of lights flickering deep within the submerged sections of the ship, long after the power should have failed. Some men claimed to see the silhouettes of sailors standing at attention on the listing deck, saluting as the ocean swallowed them whole. Were these merely hallucinations born of trauma and exhaustion? Or were they the spirits of the men who had been trapped below, unable to escape their steel coffin? The Lady Lex slipped beneath the surface with a terrifying speed, creating a massive suction that threatened to pull the nearby rafts down with her. Then she was gone, leaving only a churning patch of bubbles and debris on the dark ocean surface. The silence that followed the sinking was heavy and oppressive. The survivors floated in the darkness, waiting for rescue ships to find them. The night was filled with the sounds of men weeping and praying. Every splash in the water caused hearts to race, as the fear of sharks remained constant. But there was another presence in the water that night. Many sailors reported feeling cold spots in the warm tropical ocean and hearing whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as if the souls of the dead were rising from the depths, confused and seeking comfort among the living. The boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead felt impossibly thin. Rescue eventually came in the form of cruisers and destroyers that carefully navigated the debris field. The exhausted men were hauled aboard, their bodies covered in oil and burns. But even as they were wrapped in warm blankets and given hot coffee, the sailors could not shake the feeling that they had left a part of themselves behind. They spoke in hushed tones about the men they had seen trapped behind the portholes, and the screams that had been cut short by the rising water. The trauma of the sinking had forged a psychic bond between the survivors and the sunken ship, a connection that would haunt them for decades. The Lady Lex was gone, but she was certainly not forgotten. Years turned into decades, and the story of the United States ship Lexington passed into history. A new aircraft carrier bearing the same name was commissioned, and she too earned the nickname the Blue Ghost. Legends began to circulate that the spirits of the original crew had transferred to the new ship. Sailors on the second Lexington reported seeing men in World War II era uniforms walking the decks at night, only to vanish when approached. They spoke of cold drafts in the engine rooms and the sound of phantom footsteps in empty corridors. It seemed that the tragedy of the Coral Sea had created a spiritual residue that refused to be washed away by time. However, the true heart of the haunting remained at the bottom of the ocean. In 2018, a deep-sea exploration team located the wreck of the original United States ship Lexington. She was resting more than 3,000 meters down, sitting upright on the seabed. The images sent back by the remote-operated vehicles were breathtaking and chilling. The ship was remarkably well preserved in the low oxygen environment of the deep. Anti-aircraft guns were still pointed toward the sky, as if waiting for another attack. The paint on the hull was still visible, and the name Lexington stood out proud and defiant against the gloom. What was most unsettling about the footage was the aircraft. Devastator torpedo bombers and Wildcat fighters were scattered around the wreck site, some still resting on the ocean floor. As if parked on a runway, the insignia of the United States Navy was clearly visible on their wings. Looking at these machines, it was easy to imagine the pilots climbing into the cockpits. The explorers noted an eerie stillness around the wreck. There was very little marine life disturbing the site. It was a sanctuary of the dead, a place where time had stopped on that fateful day in May. The cameras glided past open hatches that led into the pitch-black interior, where the remains of the trapped crew still lay. As the underwater drones explored the exterior of the bridge, they captured images that looked disturbingly like faces peering out from the sediment-covered windows. It was likely just a trick of the light and shadow, but it sent shivers down the spines of the team watching the monitors on the surface. The wreck of the Lexington possessed a palpable aura of sadness and menace. It felt as though the ship was watching them, guarding its secrets and its dead with a jealous possessiveness. The technology of the modern world was intruding on a sacred grave, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken warnings. One particularly haunting image showed a coat draped over a railing, preserved by the unique chemistry of the deep ocean. It was a poignant reminder of the human cost of the sinking. That coat had belonged to a young man who had likely jumped into the sea to escape the flames. Did he make it to the rafts, or did he perish in the shark-infested waters? The artifacts scattered across the debris field were not just trash, they were the personal effects of a generation lost to war. Toothbrushes and shoes and helmets lay in the silt, silent witnesses to the tragedy. Each object held a story and a spirit attached to it. The legend of the spirits of the sunken aircraft carrier is not just about ghosts in the traditional sense. It is about the lingering energy of a massive traumatic event. When 3,000 men focus their fear and their will to live in a single location, it leaves a mark on the fabric of reality. The United States ship Lexington was a vessel of immense power, and her destruction released a shockwave that reverberated through the spiritual plane. The sailors who died aboard her did not simply cease to exist. Their terror and their courage were imprinted onto the steel that now rests in the dark. Some believe that the deep ocean acts as a preserver, not just of physical matter, but of psychic energy. The cold and the pressure lock moments in time, preventing them from dissipating. Down there in the crushing dark, the fires of 1942 are still burning in a spectral sense. The crew is still running to their battle stations. The pilots are still trying to launch their planes. The tragedy is playing out in an endless loop unseen by human eyes, but felt by anyone who dares to venture close. The wreck is a recording of death that will never be erased. There are stories among modern submariners and deep sea explorers about the anomaly of the Coral Sea. They speak of sonar equipment picking up sounds that have no biological or mechanical explanation. These are not the songs of whales or the shifting of tectonic plates. They are rhythmic pounding noises like a hammer striking a hull, or the distant muffled sound of a klaxon alarm. Some operators have reported sudden drops in temperature inside their submersibles. When passing over the coordinates of the wreck, it is as if the icy grip of the grave is reaching up from the bottom to touch the living. The concept of the blue ghost applies to the physical wreck as well. In the underwater footage, the ship appears ghostly pale, covered in a fine layer of marine snow. It looms out of the darkness like a phantom fortress, way the lights of the submersibles catch the edges of the flight deck creates illusions of movement. Shadows seem to dance between the gun emplacements. It requires a strong mind to watch the feed for hours and not begin to see things that rationally cannot be there. The mind tries to fill in the blanks of the darkness, and often it fills them with monsters. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Lexington story is the fate of the men trapped in the engineering spaces. When the order to abandon ship was given, it is believed that some communication lines were already cut. There may have been men deep below who never heard the call. They would have kept shoveling coal or monitoring gauges, trying to keep the ship alive until the very end. As the ship rolled over and sank, they would have been plunged into darkness and disorientation. The sheer terror of that ride down to the bottom is unimaginable. It is their energy that is thought to be the most potent force haunting the wreck. The connection between the sunken CV-2 and the museum ship CV-16 in Corpus Christi is often debated by paranormal investigators. Many believe that objects or names can act as conduits for spirits. By naming the new carrier Lexington, the Navy unwittingly invited the ghosts of the old ship to take up residence. Visitors to the museum ship often report feelings of overwhelming sadness in certain areas, particularly near the engine room. Is it possible that the trapped souls of the original engineering crew found a way to jump between vessels, seeking a familiar environment? But the original wreck remains the primary anchor. It sits in a world of eternal night where the sun never penetrates. The pressure is over 300 atmospheres, enough to crush a human body instantly. Yet in this hostile environment, the spirit of the Lexington endures. It serves as a memorial, not made of stone, but of steel and history. The families of the lost men often look to the coordinates of the sinking as a sacred place. They know that their fathers and grandfathers are still there on patrol in the deep. The psychological impact of the sinking on the survivors cannot be overstated. Many of them carried the ghosts of the Lexington with them until their dying days. They would wake up screaming in the night, smelling smoke and aviation fuel. They would see the faces of their lost shipmates in crowds. For them, the ship never truly sank. It remained afloat in their memories, a burning phantom that they could never escape. The ghost story is not just about the dead, it is about the living who are haunted by what they witnessed. As technology advances, we may one day be able to map the interior of the wreck without risking human life. What will we find inside the sealed compartments? Will we find the remains of the crew still at their posts? Or will we find something more intangible, a concentration of energy that defies scientific explanation? The mystery of the USS Lexington is guarded by the depth and the danger of the ocean. It challenges us to respect the boundary between the past and the present. The ocean floor is a vast graveyard filled with the wreckage of human conflict. But the Lexington stands apart due to the sheer scale of the loss and the heroism displayed. The spirits here are not malicious poltergeists, but tragic figures trapped in a moment of supreme sacrifice. They are the eternal crew of a ship that refuses to die. They wait in the darkness, perhaps hoping for a relief order that will never come. The silence of the coral sea is their shroud, and the water is their tomb. In the end, the story of the United States ship Lexington is a reminder that war leaves scars that go deeper than the physical world. The steel may rust, and the paint may fade, but the emotional imprint remains. The spirits of the sunken aircraft carrier are a testament to the intensity of the human experience in the face of death. As long as the wreck lies at the bottom of the sea, the story will continue. A silent underwater vigil kept by the ghosts of the greatest generation, waiting for the final trumpet to sound.